This is great. I'm riding today on the Military Ridge Bike Trail, which runs from Madison to Prairie du Chien. It was built on an old railroad track. Bike riding is a wonderful way to see some of Wisconsin's beautiful scenery. But riding here also makes me wonder, what happened to the trains? And why is this trail named Military Ridge? Let's investigate. If we're going to hunt for clues about Wisconsin's transportation history, we need to understand what we're looking for. According to the dictionary, transportation is the act of moving people or goods from one place to another. You probably know a lot about some kinds of transportation systems we use today, such as cars and airplanes, and of course, bikes. But people still needed to move themselves and their belongings before all those things were invented. How do you think people traveled in Wisconsin before there were cars and planes?
I think people traveled on trains.
They rode horses.
They traveled by wagon.
I think they rode donkeys.
I think they rode buggies.
In the past, I think they walked a lot.
Let's see if they're right. We can start by investigating the transportation used by some of Wisconsin's earliest people. Let's go to Madeline Island, where Ojibwe people have lived for hundreds of years. This is Earl Nyholm, an expert on Ojibwe language and culture. Mr. Nyholm, how did the early Native Americans travel?
Another way of putting that would be in English, and one way that they used to travel was by canoe.
Mr. Nyholm told me that Ojibwe people constructed birch bark canoes, which provided one of their main methods of travel. They paddled on the rivers and lakes to get from one place to another, and hauled cargo in the canoes too. Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee people had very efficient and far-reaching transportation systems long before the first Europeans arrived. I found a map that shows some of their early trails. We can see a footpath along the route of the Military Ridge State Trail where I was riding my bike. Archaeologists believe it was used for about 1,000 years. But if the trail was first used by Native Americans, when did it get the name Military Ridge? Let's see what we can find on the internet. This says the ridge is a geological feature stretching from south-central Wisconsin all the way to the Mississippi River. The slope is so gentle that bison once used the ridge as a transportation route too. Today, the Military Ridge State Trail traces the path of a military road built by soldiers in 1835. To connect forts in Green Bay, at the portage between the Fox and Wisconsin rivers, and at Prairie du Chien. The military road was created during the time when politicians representing the earliest settlers from the eastern United States and from Europe were trying to organize this area into a state. What kind of transportation do you think those people needed? I found a listing about a museum in Manitowoc that might have some clues. Let's go. This is the Wisconsin Maritime Museum in Manitowoc. It's a great place to investigate the importance of ships in our transportation history. I discovered that people and goods could travel by ship, both on the Great Lakes and on the Mississippi River, long before good roads existed in Wisconsin. Sailing ships and steamers often brought new immigrants to Milwaukee and other ports. A curator told me a schooner still sails on Lake Superior. I'm aboard the Zito. It is a reproduction of a mid-1800s coastal schooner. Thousands of new immigrants traveled to Wisconsin on ships like this in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. How do you suppose people traveled across Wisconsin around the time of statehood? I've learned about a historic site where we can find the answer. The Wade House, here in Greenbush, was built in 1850 and used as an inn for people traveling by stagecoach. Let's take a tour. Today, the Wade House has been restored so people can learn more about travel during this period. It helped me imagine what it was like to be a guest at a stagecoach inn. Sometimes people who traveled by stagecoach wrote letters about their experiences. Here's what one traveler had to say.
I was shaken, or rather thrown, unmercifully back and forth upon the newborn roads of Wisconsin, which are no roads at all, but a succession of hills and holes in which first one wheel sank and then the other. To me, that mode of traveling seemed really incredible, nor could I understand how, at that rate, we would ever get along at all.
That doesn't sound like a very easy way to travel. Let's try to imagine the scene here in Greenbush. When the Wade family arrived, travelers had to struggle over a muddy forest trail, right here, where the road is now. Then it was covered with miles of wooden planks laid side by side. Plank roads didn't last very long. The planks were hard to keep in good repair. In the meantime, more immigrants were arriving in Wisconsin. As farm families moved further and further from cities, they needed an inexpensive, reliable way to transport their crops to market. Other workers in all parts of the state also needed a way to get their goods to the people who needed them. Let's look at one example. Today, someone in rural Rock County can drive to Racine and back in a morning. In the mid-1800s, farm families needed 5 or 6 days to make that same trip using team and wagon. A wheat farmer might need to make many of those trips in order to get all of his grain transported to the lakeshore where it could be shipped to eastern markets. It was almost impossible to make a profit that way. After reaching the city, it probably took several days to sell his wheat and conduct his other business. Meanwhile, the farmer's wife and children were left alone to manage all of the farm work for a week or more at a time. The Wade House was a fun place to visit. But we still haven't figured out each piece of the story about the Military Ridge Bike Trail. The tour guide recommended we visit the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay to learn what happened next. I'm here with Tim Tennant of the National Railroad Museum. Mr. Tennant, when did the railroad come to Wisconsin?
Well, essentially in 1857, the railroads did rumble into the state, branched out in many different directions, and with that brought a great deal of change.
Mr. Tennant told me that trains were soon hauling tons of grain from rural areas to Milwaukee and other ports. And trains made it possible for other industries to grow, such as lumbering in northern Wisconsin. Many people thought bringing a railroad to their town or village was a great idea. Of course, train travel was restricted to people with money to pay for tickets. Many of the men who labored to build the railroads couldn't afford to ride the trains. And some trains in Wisconsin had separate cars for people of color. But by bringing the newspapers and mail, the railroads connected rural communities with the rest of the world. If you lived 100 years ago and were lucky enough to ride a train, you may have ridden in a car like this one, just a few miles to attend a 4th of July parade, or to go shopping in the nearest city. Or maybe you would have gone to see the circus train. Train lines ran to small communities and scenic resorts. But if trains were that important, why were so many railroads, like the one at Military Ridge, abandoned? These old pictures give us some important clues. Wisconsin's primitive road system was finally catching up. For one thing, bicycles became very popular in the 1890s. Bike riders demanded good places to ride. In the next 20 or 30 years, people also began buying cars. Some were made right here in Wisconsin. By 1915, rail travel was declining. As more roads were constructed, the railroads lost more business. And as the use of cars and bicycles grew, people needed better roads. The invention of airplanes also provided competition to the railroads. Planes were landing in Wisconsin by 1910. 50 years later, more people traveled on planes than on trains. Because of these developments, some of the smaller railroad lines were discontinued. The railroad which ran along Military Ridge, for example, was abandoned in 1979. Today a road, now called Highway 18, runs along the ridge from Madison to Prairie du Chien, just like the original trail that became the Military Road. The growth of Wisconsin's highway system allowed people to travel even more easily between rural and urban areas. Within the cities themselves, other changes were taking place. During the past 100 years, people used horse-drawn streetcars, electric cable cars, trolleys, and buses to travel within the city. Throughout our history, Wisconsin people have made choices about what's most important to them. People often disagree about what choices are best. Whenever choices are made about transportation, people need to consider both the advantages and disadvantages. In recent years, Wisconsin people have chosen to turn some old railroad corridors into recreational trails. The first part of the Military Ridge Trail was finished in 1985. Today we've discovered that the Military Ridge Bike Trail has changed a lot over the years. On a ridge where bison used to walk, an early Native American foot trail became a wagon road connecting pioneer forts, then a railroad route, a highway corridor, and now a railbed bike trail. And along the way, we found out a lot of things about the changing role of transportation in Wisconsin's history. But there's always more to discover. No matter where you live in Wisconsin, you can look for clues to the mystery right in your own neighborhood. There have been many changes in the ways people move themselves and their belongings throughout Wisconsin's history. And our transportation system is still changing. How do you think it might change in the future?
I think they're going to be going around in all these little rocket ships all around the world.
I think they'll be traveling in electric cars.
They will be traveling in big boats.
I think people get around in UFOs.
Maybe cars will run on garbage.
It will all depend on the choices you make as you grow up. In the meantime, you might want to investigate the mystery of transportation in your own community. Bye!